position. Our beautiful Berkshires would not be the same without you. I am honored now to introduce our keynote speaker, Jenny Ann Kasanoff, a professor of English at Barnard College, chairwoman of the Jacobs Pillow Board, and the recipient of both of Barnard's teaching awards, the Teaching Excellence Award in 2003 and the Emily Gregory Award in 2011. Jenny's research focuses on post-Civil War American culture. She's currently on work at a book about voting, race, and gender in American culture, the working title of which is called Voter Rights, W-R-I-T-E-S. She is also the author of Edith Wharton and the Politics of Race and many other published articles. Jenny received her PhD at Princeton University, her M.Lit at Jesus College, Oxford, and her A.B. at Harvard University. We are thrilled to have Jenny speak from our rostrum at Laurel Hill Park.
Thank you, Hillary, so much, and I'm so glad that the rostrum now has the laurel on it, because it would have been naked without it. So thanks, guys. I appreciate that. I would like to thank especially Angela Kaysen for inviting me here, and to the members of the Laurel Hill Association to speak on unceded Mohegan Nation lands, and particularly it's an honor to share this rostrum with my friend, Bonnie Hartley. Thank you. Where I grew up in Dallas, Texas, it was said that a woman's name should appear only twice in the newspaper, once when she married and the other time when she died. So even though one Mary Hopkins Goodrich single-handedly founded and mobilized the Laurel Hill Association, the nation's oldest village improvement society, even though she restored burial grounds, built railway stations, and energized the nascent 19th century environmental movement in New England, the journalistic traces of her that we have are of her marriage to John Z. Goodrich and her death as Mrs. John Z. Goodrich in 1895. But Goodrich was an eminently public person. She cared about the commonplaces that all people in Stockbridge shared. She wanted a main street lined with trees, a Housatonic river free of debris, and civic spaces that acknowledged the town's complicated relationship with the indigenous forebears and its current indigenous inhabitants. Yet at the first convening of the Laurel Hill Day Association in 1853, Mary Hopkins Goodrich, as we've heard, sat in the audience. She was not on the dais up here, which had a number of eminent men on it. There was an Owen, a Fields, two Hopkinses, and a Sedgwick. Mary Hopkins Goodrich looked on from the audience. Only after a number of speeches were given was she invited to say a few words. She stood up in the audience, and you could tell she was just chafing at the bit. She issued what can only be described. I am going to use this in delivering a lecture at school, just as a little twirl when I make a good point, you know? Thank you. I'm going to put it down, but when I need it, I'll use it. Okay, all right, fair enough. So you could tell she was just chafing at the bit. She stood up in the audience and she issued this clarion call. Men, women, and children of Stockbridge, she began. God has made us a beautiful world. Are you aware of it? Stockbridge is the jewel of Berkshire. Do you know that? Will you take the hint which the God of nature has given you in the beauty of your surroundings and make them more beautiful? If so, lend hands and teams and tools, and by your combined action it shall be done. Look, I'm not gonna lie. Folks don't need to take a hint from the god of nature when Mary Hopkins Goodrich was in the House. She would have gotten the infrastructure bill passed in the first 100 days. So why didn't this galvanizing force have a place on the Laurel Hill Day podium? And what would happen if it were otherwise? Today I'm going to talk about a woman's place, even though it says otherwise in your program, because it seems like this is what we're really all here to discuss. We could always explain why Mary Hopkins Goodrich wasn't on this podium. We could use words like chauvinism and sexism and call it a day. We could pity all the benighted 19th century New Englanders who didn't know better. Incidentally, if that were the answer, then my speech would be a lot shorter than I understand traditional Laurel Hill Day speeches usually are. One faithful member recalled a Lennox woman who listened to a series of marathon Laurel Hill Day speeches while seated on one of the hill's hard benches. Afterwards, she was approached by the association president who offered her a seat on the board. She reportedly replied, "I've just sat on it for 2 hours and that's enough." So I'll try to keep it brief. What I want to consider today is the kind of cultural and political work that associating women, and particularly white women, with privacy does. Who benefits when Mary Hopkins Goodrich is even nominally kept out of the public sphere? What does the public sphere look like because privacy is, what I'm going to suggest, is gendered and racial? That is, because it's female and white. What happens when privacy is made female and white? The idea that a white woman's place is in the home is central to stories that Americans tell to themselves about political power. Who is in power, who has access to power, who gets to vote, and even how we vote today. So I want to give you 2 examples of what I mean. The first is a local example. By the time Goodrich died in 1895, the Laurel Hill Association had spawned a much larger movement across New England. It was called the Country Life Movement, and Stockbridge, the jewel of Berkshire, was its prototype. For Edith Wharton, places like Stockbridge and Lennox were as close as America came to the mythical European patriae, where everything speaks of long familiar intercourse between the earth and its inhabitants. This is Wharton. Every field has a name, a history, a distinct place of its own. And what Wharton really meant was that everyone knew his or her or their place in the social hierarchy. When he visited New England in 1904, Henry James admired the note of the aristocratic in the air. Only in New England, their friend Barrett Wendell agreed, was there still, quote, a frank recognition of certain social classes as superior to others. These tributes obviously had a dark side. For many Eastern elites at the turn of the 20th century, praising New England was code for criticizing racial pluralism, class mobility, and immigration. The historian and social Darwinist John Fiske, for example, boasted with pride that neither the Irishman nor the African American had ever set foot in his hometown of Petersham, Massachusetts. Such towns were supposedly unchanging places of Yankee stock. Preserving the New England town in the Gilded Age was a way to say that the region and the United States more generally should stay Anglo-Saxon and white. Of course, none of this was really true. What European colonizers called, without imagination, New England, is kind of on the nose, wasn't it? had always been a pluralist crossroads for indigenous peoples, immigrants from non-Northern European countries, and people of African descent, enslaved or otherwise. But in the late 19th century, the declining white Protestant birth rate, combined with waves of immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe, the Great Migration of people fleeing from the Jim Crow South, and the exponential growth of US cities were all reasons that New England's Yankee farms and Yankee farmers suddenly seemed like an endangered species. According to the Country Life movement, New England was in racial, economic, and demographic decline. Social scientists of the period scurried to analyze the situation. MIT economist Francis Amasa Walker and Harvard's Thomas N. Carver blamed US immigration policies for forcing old New England families to shrink in size in order to preserve their standard of living. And then others said the exact opposite, that New England families were getting too big, and that was a sign that New England was in decline. In 1912, the eugenicists Arthur Eastbrook and Charles Davenport published a study of the unfortunate descendants of a so-called roving Dutchman who had fathered several generations of, quote, ignorant, unintelligent, indolent, and alcoholic New Englanders, and sent Yankee stock into a tailspin. By the early 20th century, places like Massachusetts, Vermont, and Maine had become the focus of full-fledged nativist panic. The fight to save the region turned towns like Stockbridge into a national fetish. Now, the East Coast media had a field day about this problem. They said that the young, the hopeful, and ambitious were making an exodus from New England, as one popular magazine said in 1895, and behind them they were leaving, quote, the superannuated, the feeble, and the dull. Andrew Carnegie said, New England may lose her position as the dominant strain in the Republic. And if so, that national decline was imminent. Theodore Roosevelt similarly warned that white New Englanders were selling the family farm to strangers. And this is what Roosevelt told an audience in 1907. It would be a calamity to have our farms occupied by a lower type of people than the hard-working, self-respecting, independent, and essentially manly women, manly and womanly men and women, I know it's going to screw that up, who have hitherto constituted the most typically American and on the whole the most valuable element of the whole nation. Ambitious native-born young men and women who now tend away from the farm must be brought back to it. So a cry went up across the eastern seaboard. Save New England. Bring the Yankee diaspora back to the abandoned old farm. The descendants of the region's Yankee stock could revive the region's declining fortunes by reclaiming their ancestral land, but not as farmers, but as second homeowners and nostalgic tourists. New Hampshire Governor Frank West Rollins created something called Old Home Week in 1897, a civic celebration that was clearly patterned after Laurel Hill Day. It was designed to lure prodigal New Englanders back to their ancestral homes. Sons and daughters of New Hampshire, he said, wherever you are, listen to the call of the Granite State. Come back, come back. Do you not hear the call? What has become of the old home where you were born? Is it still in your family? If not, why not? Why do you not go and buy it this summer? Okay, a subtle real estate agent Rollins was not, but nevertheless, such festivals and pageants put New England's private dwellings at the forefront of the nation's culture wars. Images of white womanhood were key to the old home's appeal. A vacation in New England, Rollins insisted, meant, quote, plain country fare served by a pretty girl, a farmer's daughter, neatly and prettily dressed. If you were to visit the Berkshires, you would find what another writer called the true mountain-bred girl, with her flushed face, large wild eyes, and slightly disheveled hair. A woman who might easily be mistaken, we are told, for Aphrodite herself. Such images of winsome Penelopes beckoning their prodigal Odysseus's, or Odyssei, I'm not sure, point the way to the way that images of white women were used to encourage a kind of eugenic New England revival. The message was clear: come to New England, meet a white Yankee girl, preferably with your own DNA, and fix up the old home and propagate more white Yankees. It's not surprising that this is exactly what happens in Edith Wharton's 1917 novel, Summer. Now, for those of you who were forced to read the frosty Ethan Frome in high school, I encourage you to check out the much sexier Berkshire's bodice ripper, Summer, a novel that Wharton herself called Hot Ethan. Okay, one of the focal points of Summer is an Old Home Week celebration. In Wharton's novel, the keynote speaker is the town's most prominent lawyer. His name is Lawyer Royale. He is a man who, like the town itself, has become kind of decrepit and sad. He speaks to an audience of returning New Englanders. He stands on the dais, surrounded, and I love this, by a bevy of young women all dressed in white. Exactly. As he speaks to his audience of returning New Englanders, the speech he gives is pure Governor Rollins. He urges diasporic New Englanders to come back to their old home and to come back for good. But here's the twist. Among the young women dressed in white on the podium is his own foster daughter, Charity Royale, who, unbeknownst to her guardian, is pregnant by one of the handsome Yankee visitors in the town for the summer. I know what you're thinking. Has this handsome young architect, who happens to have a specialty in colonial architecture, come back to the town for good? Will he marry Charity and thereby revive home, lineage, and colonial future all in one fell swoop? Is Charity herself the site of a kind of sexy colonial revival? In short, does Charity begin and end at home? What about her foster father? Oh, come on, you know I'm not going to spoil the ending. You got to read it. But here's my point. In both history and literature, the symbolic place of white women is central to systems of white power and how white power has moved itself forward. In the time I have remaining, then, I want to turn to a second example and suggest that these ideas of a woman's place remain central to how we think about voting in the United States. Images of white women have long played a key role in voter restriction, and they still do today. Let's take, for example, the secret ballot. You may be surprised to learn that voting in private is a relatively recent innovation. It was adopted between 1889 and 1892 as a way to combat working class and immigrant-fueled machine politics in the North and black male voting in the South. Before that, voting was a public activity. Party representatives handed out tickets, or you clipped them from the newspaper and you carried them to the polling place. Once a man deposited his ticket, which he didn't have to be able to read because it had been given to him, he would deposit it at this public space under the watchful eyes of all his neighbors and everyone he knew. After the adoption of the secret ballot, however, the franchise became less of a rugged right than a delicate, finely calibrated privilege. With its walls, curtains, and restricted guest list, the polling place under the secret ballot looked like nothing so much as a private home, a domestic space defined by its discretionary hospitality and its protection from intruders and foes. In my research, I've discovered that the American ballot box itself has repeatedly been imagined as the body of a white woman. To protect the so-called purity of the ballot box has, since the 18th century, served as a rallying cry for voting restrictionists. James Madison urged that elections be chaste, for example, but the better example is from 2000, when supporters of George W. Bush demanded an end to the hand count of Florida's disputed ballots on the grounds that manhandling the ballot would compromise its worrisomely pregnant Chad. In the North, the secret ballot grew up hand in hand with growing anti-immigrant politics. It's no coincidence that the fetish of the old home coincided with the advent of voting in private. In the South, the secret ballot was inextricable from Jim Crow. When the 15th Amendment granted Black men the right to vote in 1870, conservatives in both North and South began to align the ballot box with the private body of a white woman. They created a world of alternate facts in which the ballot box was no longer a site of public decision-making, but it was a hallowed receptacle that had to be protected from intruders and foes. Anyone who intruded on voting was said to be violating the purity of the ballot box. By voting, then, Black men were elusively attacking the body of a white woman. This is where the secret ballot comes in. Like a home with private hospitality, the secret ballot was designed to domesticate and privatize the very public and very collective act of voting. In his best-selling 1905 novel, The Klansman, a novel that would go on to be the basis for Birth of a Nation, the film of 1915, Thomas Dixon Jr. goes still further. Dixon draws an analogy between the privacy of the voting booth and the stylized invisibility and isolation of the Ku Klux Klan. The reclusive cave in which the Klan meets, the technical name, in case you were wondering, is Clavern with a K, is in a sense both the ultimate old home and the ultimate voting booth. It's the place where white men preserve white supremacy in the name of white women. In the Klansman's predictably racist climax, a Black voter rapes a young white woman, a young woman whom Dixon has repeatedly identified with the ballot box itself. And so, to avenge this outrage, in sweeps the Ku Klux Klan with its pointy white hoods, its masked faces, and its weird nomenclature of dragons and Kleagles, and yes, conversations. The Knights put an end to Black suffrage by lynching Marion's attacker. The Klan's fetish for absolute anonymity, disembodiment, and privacy replicate the aesthetics of the secret ballot. Both the invisible empire and the secret ballot are ways of reimagining American politics as secretive, as individualistic, and as white. White women have and remain central to that enterprise. So when we think about a woman's place, we need to think not only about what white women are doing in relation to systems of inequality and injustice, but we also need to think about what is being done in the name of white women. Retreating into the old home is bad for democracy. Instead, we need to seek out to amplify and to activate a vibrantly pluralist public sphere. We need to take space and make space. Mary Hopkins Goodrich knew this, and we can honor her legacy by doing likewise. Thank you.